It all started on Halloween, the curator awaiting me in my console room to warn me of days to come. He told me of warnings from future incarnations and not to trust them. I haven't seen him since, and I'm not too sure if I trust him or not. I am currently traveling with Edric. The boy often reminds me of myself when I started, and after we left Romana in E-Space, well, he needed a break, and personally I don't blame him. He has been through so much, and, although he annoys me, I understand why he is the way he is. I dropped him off at Coal Hill to learn more about N-Space and humanity. It is a lovely school, and who knows, he may meet a friendly student named Susan Foreman. But that is a story for another time. I've been thinking a lot recently about Glycopolis and fixing my chameleon circuit. I've always been meaning to, but being a time traveler, well, you just never seem to find the time when you walk through eternity. Anyway, this is the story of how I retired and how I made the greatest mistake of my lives. Are you sitting comfortably? Good. Oh, and one last question before we begin. Would you like a jelly baby? The story begins in an empty TARDIS. I never liked an empty TARDIS, as I always found myself talking to myself. Many companions have walked through this majestic box, such as a parrot, Sarah, Harry, Leela, Naomi, and so many more. Now, where was I? Ah, yes. Well, I was in the TARDIS alone, and reading a Mr. Man book, based on me, called Dr. Four. What a wonderful little book that was, and so were the ones prior. I don't read the ones based on my future adventures, because of the timelines and all that, but I fear from one of the covers that I will wear a vegetable in the future. After I finished the book, I glared at the console. What a wonderful machine it was. Alongside that, she was my constant companion. Even after all these numerous people and animals left my ship, I still had her. The TARDIS was swiftly traversing the time vortex, when, all of a sudden, there was a shudder, as if we were entering a time corridor, but not as extreme as that. I automatically leapt out of my chair, which I used for picnics in the TARDIS, and jumped towards the console as I tried to control it. The shaking didn't make it easy, but I eventually stabilized my TARDIS. I then began to wonder what caused the turbulence. As I looked upon the scanner, nothing seemed out of the ordinary, until I realized that the TARDIS was no longer in the vortex, and with no indication, it had landed on a planet. This was strange even for me, and you should see my Saturdays, or Tuesday afternoons. There was usually some sort of indication that my ship was about to land, like that glorious wheezing sound, or most likely an explosion of some sort. But this time, there was nothing. And that not only perplexed me, but it worried me. The scanner wasn't really telling me anything about where or when we had landed. Thus I deduced that there was only one way to find out, that it certainly wasn't dilly-dallying alone in my TARDIS. I had to venture out into the unknown. I leaned towards the door. But before walking towards it, I was hesitant. I could sense an evil presence nearby. In all honesty, I didn't know how that worked. But it just did, like with those damn Daleks in London or Wotan. I knew I was heading into trouble. But what exactly I was about to face, I had no idea. All I knew is that I was afraid, and that was a feeling I certainly was not used to, as this fear was genuine. I hadn't felt such an overwhelming fear since my first time facing the great spiders, and my everlasting journey hurtling towards Unit HQ when I last died and then regenerated into who I am now. Hello. There was only one way to find out what evil awaited me outside that door, whatever indescribably fearsome foe I was yet to face, and that was by walking out of my faithful TARDIS and venturing outside. I opened the door, and what did I see? A forest! Quite a lovely forest at that, with luscious green leaves, and you could hear the crickets chirping as I looked up towards the night sky, and the stars above me were, for lack of a better word, stunning. The moonlight that beamed down from the full moon created a pathway of light upon the fresh grass. In truth, I knew this was all too good to be true. Everything was perfect, and seemingly catered to me, as if it were luring me into a trap. Perhaps I've been in too many traps to know when things are too good to be true. They usually are. Before I could move any further, the TARDIS vanished. There were no engines wheezing, nor any indication that it was going to vanish. But it just did, in an instant. I didn't know what to say nor do, and I just stared hopelessly, as the forest around me was no longer a sight to behold, but manifested itself into a forest you would usually witness in a horror movie, a really scary one at that. As it manifested itself into this horrifying forest, it sent multiple shivers down my spine and gave me goosebumps. Oh, Goosebumps was a great series now I come to think about it, but that's besides the point. The wind was incredibly strong, and it was almost pushing me, telling me to move along the pathway designated for me. I never liked being designated pathways, or being told what to do. It really wasn't my style, but it appeared as if I had no choice, as the wind kept getting stronger, and almost called out to me, telling me to move. That sense of overwhelming fear was once again very present, as my legs started to uncontrollably tremble, which travelled through my body towards my hand, and the next thing you know, they were both at it. The forest was dark, with no light in sight, not a beautiful star in the sky, and the moon was now covered by thick layers of grey clouds, as if it were about to rain any second. There was a howling, and just like that, thoughts of getting mauled by wolves or unfathomable creatures came to mind. Even though the ever-present fear almost prevented me from venturing into the unknown that was in front of me, my curiosity was even stronger than the overwhelming fear. It was almost begging me to go into the forest and investigate why the TARDIS brought me here and what brought me here. It isn't like I had much choice anyway, but I always knew that my curiosity would be my downfall. I began walking towards the forest, and, as I did, I sensed that I was being followed. Thus not to alert my stalker, who I deduced was the one who brought me here initially, I walked swiftly on. Once again I was fighting my curiosity and the urge to see who was stalking me. As I kept walking, I then came to a halt and turned around. In the distance, on the horizon, was the silhouette of a man, a very familiar man, and I felt as if I were looking in a mirror. I didn't recognize the man, and he was glowing. He appeared to be covered in rags, and almost mummified. The presence of him reassured me, but also terrified me. I traversed the forest, and, before I knew it, the pathway was no more. The forest was horrifying, as it felt as if the trees were alive and were peering down at me. I looked at the leaves as they decayed in front of me. The grass beneath my feet was withering as I took each step. It was as if the world around me was trying to tell me I was dead or about to die. Was this my hell? Was the mysterious figure following me some sort of demon, or perhaps an angel, or reaper of some sort? I continued to pace around the forest, trying to recollect my steps and find some sort of life or help, but nothing availed. I was well and truly lost in the middle of nowhere. Depending on where or when I was, I often revelled in the very thought of being lost. It often led to new adventures to be had, or new people to meet. But here, everything was dead or dying. There were no new adventures to be had. And as I paced around, I felt the presence of whomever had decided to follow me, getting closer and closer. Every step I took, it got closer, and as I stopped moving, it stopped alongside me. I began to scan my surroundings properly, and at first, there seemed to be nothing of significance. But then, I began looking at the details. The leaves were changing, from season to season, every few milliseconds. It was somehow so unnoticeable that my surroundings were changing, and it took true observation to even notice. The forest around me was in a state of constant flux, regenerating every few seconds. It then dawned on me why I was brought here. The realization hit me harder than a brick wall, and then it didn't. I then began to walk on. That feeling of being followed was no more, as it felt like whatever was following me had walked past, as if it had walked over my grave and went for a spot of tea. At the time, I didn't mean that literally, but as I followed the pathway, I found a setup of some sorts, waiting for me. I couldn't quite make it out at first, and I got the sense that it was a mirage, even though it was freezing, and we weren't in a desert. At the end of the pathway, there was a glorious and well-prepared picnic laid out on the grass, and on a table to the side, there was a book, and that book was my 900-year diary, my diary from the future. And at first, it perplexed me, but then, out of thin air, appeared a future acquaintance of mine, one I shouldn't know, but seemed ever so familiar, and this time, it wasn't my future wife that I still vaguely remember. It was me. Well, I say it was me. It's all rather complicated and boring, so I shall save you the details. The being that was in front of me went by the title of the Watcher, a being of pure mystery, much like myself. Probably because he is a manifestation of me that usually appears when I regenerate. Well, sometimes. Well, there were rumors that he only appears when you are on your last regeneration. The theories surrounding the Watcher and how they are all true, once again, is far too complex to explain in such a short space of time. As soon as I saw him, it was as if he had been there my entire life. This life, as if he was guiding me and watching me up until now. Was this it, I thought? Wondering if this was the end? Watchers only appear when you reach your final destination, when the moment had been prepared for. But this couldn't be it, surely. I had so much more to do, such as fixing that damn chameleon circuit and visiting Legopolis. He was often silent, and his voice was indescribable. But as soon as you listened to it, you felt a sense of recognition and comfort. Not quite the unimaginable terror I thought I was about to face. But if this really was my time to die, then no wonder I was terrified. Even then, I was content that one day I was going to die. One day, I would regenerate, and a new incarnation would take my place. And that was completely fine. We all change, and that is just part of life. And in my case, death. I suppose in my case, death is more of a part of life than anything else. I face it on a daily basis, and sometimes I go through it, and sometimes I take it for tea and crumpets, but that's a whole different story. In truth, I have had an extremely long life. I have had highs, such as defeating bubble-wrap-looking creatures, meeting so many great people, preventing catastrophes, and lows, such as sucking that great creature. Well, once again, let's not talk about that one, shall we? I sat down on a chair that was placed beside the table. I was ever so tempted to read the diary, but knew if I were to read it, then all of the events within the contents of that well-written book would happen as told, and free will within my own life and how I go about it would be no more. Once you have read something in a novel, it has to happen, and it will happen, as written. That time can no longer be rewritten if you've read about it, and how it specifically happened. The Watcher just stood there, watching over me, as he does, and I invited him to sit down, but he just stood there. The Watcher opened the book, and I tried not to look, but instead of writing, there was a picture, and it was harder to miss. It was a drawing of me, falling from some sort of telescope. I tried to fight the urge to look, but there was no fighting now. The moment was prepared for. I then remembered that Halloween night in my secondary console room, and as I did, the TARDIS reappeared behind the Watcher. In my fury, I walked into the box. The Watcher followed slowly, and then I shut the door. I kept repeating the idea that time can be rewritten in my mind. The Watcher whispered in my ear that my fate was sealed, but I refused to believe it, and I walked out of the console room. I walked back in, and the Watcher was at the controls. He had already input the coordinates for Coal Hill to collect Adric into the TARDIS computer, and it was as if he was guiding me. At first I listened to the Watcher, but then I thought, what if this was what the curator was warning me about? And a billion other thoughts raced through my mind at top speed. Each one predicted several outcomes and proposed more questions than answers. The TARDIS began to take off. The Watcher was flying it. The question was, am I going to do what he wants me to do? He told tales of Legopolis and of fixing my TARDIS chameleon circuit, warning me about a great disaster if I don't make the right choice, if the moment isn't prepared for. I had a choice to make, and at the time, I believed that the one I ended up making was the one with the best outcome, trusting the curator and not listening to any warnings given to me by future incarnations, and that included the likes of the Watcher. The Watcher told me to pick up Adric and prepare the moment that is my death by deciding to go to Legopolis and fix my TARDIS. I decided against it, because that choice not only ultimately ends up in me dying and the Master destroying Legopolis, but as I mentioned earlier, the curator did warn me of times to come and future incarnations. I then took the TARDIS to Hexford, and I am now retired, living the rest of my lives within a fairly nice cottage, named Nest Cottage, with Mrs. Flimley and Mike Yates, and the occasional guest here and there. We have fought great evil, such as hornets, and so much more. Adric, in the end, decided upon staying at Coal Hill and exploring the universe on his own, here and there with this device he built. I don't really understand it, but good on him. I'm having the time of my lives, so yes, I do believe that ultimately I made the right choice. But really, who knows? Who knows? I do. And if you are listening to this, then the universe is in great danger. Actually, no. The multiverse is in great danger. What you have just listened to is me making the wrong choice. A choice that had disastrous consequences. I should know as well. I'm the curator, and was manipulated into doing the Emperor's bidding, into fooling my younger self, into not listening to the Watcher. Not only does that mean I have retired prior to falling from the Pharos project, but the Emperor has also prevented my fall from the telescope from when it did happen, and now it hasn't. Confused? Completely understandable. But I need you to listen. The Emperor sent me back in time to warn the Doctor not to listen to warnings from future incarnations. This led to the Fourth Doctor not listening to the Watcher and living a joyous extended life in Hexford. Right? Following so far? Good. As all of this was happening, the Emperor was manipulating what happened when I actually did go to Lepopolis, and made it so I survived the fall that initially led to my regeneration. This led to me retiring after the fall and before the fall, creating a huge paradox. This paradox created a dark dimension, one huge enough that the Emperor has stored his armies within. It is a huge trap for my past incarnations. I know he is listening to this, so I don't have much time. But I hope you understand. Because it is all up to you now. Your very existence is at stake. And while it is, it's the same case for the incarnations after you. It is best the one after this whole catastrophe fixes the mess caused by his previous incarnation. Bye-bye!